Great. If you go to the next slide, please. So we like to start this story by thinking about traditional ways to measure and tackle poverty along the history. And some of you might be familiar already with poverty lines as an indicators of this. Poverty lines are generally concerned with subsistence. In the past, the goal has been really to get farmers just over the poverty line. However, smallholders really often live close to this line, and still they are not going to be able to be resilient and have a decent standard of living. So that's why the living income concept emerged. So there was already living wage discussions going on around 2016, 15, and the living income concept really builds on decades of work of living wage. So just to look at the difference, as you can see on the slide, living wage is looking at a worker earning enough for a standard work week to enable for himself and his family to afford a decent standard of living. But living income has an approach that applies to the household. So they both have the idea of a decent standard of living, but the difference is that one applies to workers and the other one applies to smallholders. So living income is about the income level that would enable a family to afford a decent standard of living. So decency and resilience underpins the concept of living income. Is really about earning enough to live a decent life and having a buffer for the unexpected. As I said a couple of times, we are talking about a household concept, so it really refers to income for the entire household. So all the familiars that are depending on that family unit. So in a nutshell, the living income concept really goes above the traditional notions of poverty and are really concerned about the subsistence and survival and moving into the decency and the standard of living. So if you go to the next one, this diagram depicts the living income story. There are three key components in this story, and is really the key to understand the concept we were explaining. On the left, you can see in green all the elements that constitute a basic decent standard of living. This is the ideal scenario. That's what we talk about when we talk or what we define living income benchmarks. So the benchmark is really trying to answer the question of how much does a household in a particular place need to earn from all income sources in order to live a decent standard of living. As you can see on the box, there's different groupings of costs. So here we are understanding that we consider water, food, housing, but also essential needs such as healthcare, transportation, or clothing. But we're also looking at other unexpected events carried from, for example, climate, droughts, or any emergency. So in calculating the benchmarks, the two key points to note are the household size and the location, because that will determine the level of the living income or the benchmark. And if we look now on the right, we will see the reality. The first part is what we term actual income. The context, in this context, actual income is actually what the household is earning now, and it can come from a variety of sources of income, not just the sale of, for example, the produce of the main crop, but also it's very common that smallholders supplement their income with secondary crops, for example, alternating within the seasons, or that one member of the family work off farm, or that they receive other sources of income, such as remittances. So this is really important because one of the challenges that we face when we look at this concept is to really be able to measure adequately both living income benchmarks and actual income, so farmers or smallholders, and being able to understand the gap. So when we look at the diagram, we can see there's a little bar in between actual income and the benchmark, and that's referred as the income gap, which is defined as the comparison between the actual income against the living income benchmarks. So that's an indication of how far that actual income is from the ideal situation of that minimum living income benchmark. So now that we've looked at the concept, we can maybe move to the next slide, which is about the community of practice that some of us work on. And this living income community of practice is really been running from 2017 and is an alliance of partners that really are focused um, on starting the concept of living income, measuring and really promoting action to close the income gap. So really reflecting on what we just saw on the diagram, understanding what is a living income benchmark, what is the actual income, how do you measure it, and really how you action on closing that gap. And this is always done through collaboration. So we have a very big community that work together and collaborate to exchange knowledge on these aspects. It was founded by GIZ at Sustainable Food Lab and ISIL, but is really constructed through many organizations that bring their knowledge and support the understanding of this issue and the solutions that might work. Next slide. So this is just my last slide on living income, and I just wanted to bring some highlights from our event on 2023. So we traveled to Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, and we really had an excellent workshop on the evidence that support living income programs. So very much the topic we are going to discuss today. And we brought a lot of the operational staff from across different stakeholders to discuss about what works in closing the income gap. We also do a lot of other engagement events. So for example, the LICOP webinars that we run regularly, we are also part of external events like the recent one at the FAO. And we also partner with other organizations to advance on this issue. Next one. So now in the next, I think I have 5 minutes. I will try to be quick. I'm going to share a bit more on KISM and on Evidensia. So the intent of us sharing these platforms is to really bring you these tools to expand your awareness about evidence that might help with your programs to close the income gap, or about what other interventions are going on and what sort of innovations are in place to help with income improvements. So KISM was launched in 2022 in partnership with ISIL and Evidensia. So this is a product that is part of the CGR Rethinking Food Markets. The CGR Rethinking Food Markets really aims to bring evidence on what type of innovations or incentive structure or policies are more effective to create a more equitable sharing of income and employment in food markets. So KISM is really a place to host that research, and is a gateway to help farmer organizations, food businesses, governments, and practitioners to make better informed choices or investments to have an impact on the sustainability of food value chain. So if you go to the next slide. So the KISM is really designed to share cutting-edge research emerging from CGR, as I said, and really convene stakeholders that are key in food markets to support that decision-making process. So it's also a gateway to get relevant research from other knowledge platforms such as Evidensia, but also the Value Chain Knowledge Portal, for example, which is a product from the CGR Rethinking Fund Markets initiative. So next slide. There's a bit more on KISM. So we have a research library and that constitutes the core of the platform, where you can revise all the resources in the platform, but also is a place to really engage with others. So it's not just a one-stop shop for all the research projects of the initiative, but it's also a place where you can engage through events or through discussion forums. The knowledge tools really offer you space to find research emerging from the initiative as well, but in a very different way. So it will visualize the research across a map, for example, or really show you some key knowledge gaps that you can find through the research available. Just a small if you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is just a zoom to the library, but I just wanted to mention that the Rethinking Food Markets initiative is researching on 3 key topics, which is the core of the KISM. So global integrated value chain, so how you can innovate to improve vertical integration, food standard certification, or inclusive value chain contracting. Is also looking at investigating sustainable value chain infrastructure, product upgrading, and inclusive business models, and is also innovating, looking at logistics and digital finance. So all these been innovations to be researched about to have an ultimate impact on income and employment. So finally, I'm gonna turn into Evidensia, which was already introduced by Alessandra. Evidensia's mission is to really put the evidence at the heart of sustainability actions and decisions. We really want to ensure that credible research and evidence have an impact on corporate and government decisions. And the focus really for this platform is market-based approaches. So the platform provides an easy access to credible research and evidence, and has built a common knowledge base to enable the access to this curated evidence. And it also provides, for example, analysis and insights to improve the access of users to this evidence. And it also has some tools to visualize the evidence, so it can show the gaps and the availability of evidence easily. So here you can see a zoom to the library, which includes everything that Evidensia offers in one place, and there's a very sophisticated search engine where you can filter and you can, for example, access to the research that Evidensia contains on living income. So as you can see here, the filter is applied and you have 76 results, and each resource will determine what type of evidence we are looking at. So Evidensia has a very good categorization of evidence types, and you can access those and get that information on what sort of methods were used on those resources through the library. The next one. Okay, and finally, as I was saying, Evidensia also has interactive features to visualize evidence, and the visual summaries are a great way to visualize the results of very robust reports. So the as you can see in the screen, each little box is showing the result from one study, and you will get a very detailed information on what actually the research is saying with regards to specific impacts. I think that was my last slide. Well, just the end on Evidensia and our supporters.
Thank you, Rita. So thank you, Rita, for this introduction to the living income concept, the community of practice, and the two research platforms. So I'm resharing in the chat box the links in case you're interested to find out more. And now we will move to our next expert. So we have with us Yuka Warts. Yuka is the senior researcher for sustainable value chain at the Wageningen University. And in this presentation, we will dive more into different facts and figures related to living income that are based on the latest studies and research. Over to you, Yuka.
Thank you very much. Also very happy to be here today. Well, I tried to capture 15 years of research into 10 minutes. So that proved quite a challenge because there's a lot to say always. And maybe as a starting point, we've been doing quite a lot of research in different commodity sectors, such as tea and coffee and cocoa, as you can see here. And we've been capturing this in several reports, which are coming out, have been coming out in the last years, but also will be coming out early next year. And I will present results of that, capturing sort of the overall results and trends we see over all the different research, and diving into sort of two case examples for two commodities. So next slide, please. So this is a visual based on data, not necessarily from our own research. So it's actually compiling different studies in one visual, which we've done together with IDH. And I saw IDH in the group, in the participants also. And this study, this visual actually shows the proportion of income that households earn compared to the total living income benchmark. So for instance, if your living income benchmark is $4,000 per year and you earn $2,000 per year, then your the figure would be 50%, just to be very practical. And these figures are done based on two types of data. So it's either total household income or the commodity income. And that's, I think, the first lesson for living income analysis. Try to capture total household income in any studies, even through simple measures, because it's really telling what the opportunities are to grow your income if you also know what other options are to earn an income, or what the other incomes are. So as you can see here, there's quite a differences in the proportion of the living income benchmark earned by the households between 100% in Brazil. So the average Brazilian coffee farmer actually earns 100% of the living income benchmark with coffee only. And then there's some very small numbers where in Uganda, for instance, that the Ugandese coffee farmers earn 2% of the living income benchmark with coffee. And then you see 50, 60%. So a lot of the figures, if you look at total household income, are about 50% on average. I think that's a clear thing we see. The other angle, which is important to stress here, is that these are averages, and we see huge differences between households in supply chains. So even in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, in cocoa, there are households actually earning an income, a living income, but the average living income gap, as Rita explained earlier, is $3,000 per year. So basically, families with a living income gap need to earn $3,000 per year more to earn a living income. This is quite a large number, a large increase. So per country, all the sort of the living income gaps add up to billions of dollars per year. And I think that's an important thing to realize, all of us. Next slide, please. We also added the numbers for different types of studies from different types of sectors. As you can see here, coffee and cocoa and groundnut, most in African countries. And there you actually see the same. This is again only looking at the studied activity, so in only income from coffee and cocoa. But still you see, well, 60% of the benchmark is earned at maximum through these types of activities. Next slide, please. So when you look at all the data and all the studies, there's two conclusions. In essence, there's very little studies or few studies that are actually public. So we've been able to sort of compile a lot of data also using information that wasn't necessarily public, but also that you show, looking at the effectiveness of interventions, that at scale, we haven't seen the majority of the households going to substantially increase their income, which has been the objective of a lot of initiatives in the past decades. And the same also, we still see large proportions of households earning below the World Bank extreme poverty line, and only small proportions earning a living income. So there's clearly something happening, and we just haven't seen. So if anyone has studies that show substantial income increase at scale in a certain country or supply chain, let me know, because I'm really interested to learn. And what we also found out is that often the root causes of poverty weren't adequately addressed, or only addressed for a small group, or only partly. And that is quite a challenge then to achieve the income increase we would like to see. So basically, we need to address those needs, but also the possibilities and aspirations, right? So sometimes not necessarily the aspirations of households for themselves or for their children lie in cocoa, for instance. Also what we need is more investments, and I will dive into this a bit more later. So next slide, please. So if you look at the root causes of poverty, what we found also by analyzing lots of data and also talking to people is basically the inability to invest is a really big one. So what we've seen is we've been assuming households to invest in their cocoa farm, their coffee farm, their tea farm, and that would allow them to grow their income over time, leading to much higher incomes. Well, there's much more to investment than only to income growth than investment, but we've seen serious challenges of households to actually invest money, but also time and actually hiring labor to do the work. While we see clear links between investments, monetary investments, but also time investments and higher volumes produced. There's a high risk of actually investing. So that's hampering households to, for instance, take credit and choose to sort of take a loan and having to pay a certain interest rate. But also in some places, the cost of a decent standard of living is pretty high, right? So then it's very difficult to get there. This is linked to the fact that households have very little voice in intervention design, policy design, etc. There's a tendency for oversupply, and also there's a high price and sales risk of the households. And this is all leading to unstable and unrewarding prices. And then a question mark also, because I was able to highlight some of the knowledge gaps we are having, is basically our payments for ecosystem services, carbon credits, etc. Do they add significantly to household income? We don't know yet, but we're investigating that. And what are the possibilities there? Well, this all leads to basically low volumes of cocoa, coffee, and tea produced. Not necessarily low yields. So sometimes a farm can be small, but can have very high yields. But then in total, there's a maximum volume that can be obtained, even with high yields. And finally, a really important one is few alternative income sources, which are available, which prove better options than coffee, tea, and cocoa. And people are not necessarily moving quickly. So labor stickiness, please go down. Yeah. And low education levels we still see after quite some investments in education. So we still see very low education levels. Next slide, please. We move to coffee, sorry. We move to Kenya to look at coffee farming households. And here you can see to the left, the households who earn a living income and their living income benchmark in green. And to the right, we see the households not earning a living income. And on average, they have a gap of $1,800. And they earn only around $600 in total from coffee, but also other sources. So the income is really low. And here we see really huge differences between the households. So there are some households, 12% actually earns a living income and have much larger farms. But still, farm sizes are really small. The average farm size is 0.6 hectare, of which is 0.3 for coffee. But also, they spend very little time on coffee production on general. So some households spend a lot of the time they have available, but other households spend very little. And on average, their total household income is $1,000 per year. So these are really low incomes. And this basically describes the vast differences between the households. Next slide, please. And this brings us to a conclusion of all the research we've seen and the high variability between the households, is that even though the contexts are different and the countries are different, we generally see, despite some exceptions, we see 4 broad groups between households and different barriers to earning a living income if nothing changes. I think that's important to mention. The moment, for instance, the structure of a sector changes and the price increases or doubles, obviously this is a huge change, and that would help a lot more farmers earn a living income. But if nothing changes, then this is what you see in terms of possibilities and barriers to earn a living income. So the largest group, household group, have huge barriers to earn a living income because their living income gaps are so large and they do not have the possibility to invest and grow their income. And there's a small group earning a living income or very close to, who actually have the means to invest to grow their income. Next slide. So now we move to Côte d'Ivoire to look at cocoa farming households. And here you see barrier groups. Actually, I think we have one more group here in this assessment, where we basically looked at the characteristics of the households, and we assessed the barriers to earning a living income based on farm size, based on room to invest, and some other criteria, which I'm happy to share in Q1 next year. The paper comes out. And here you can see the huge differences between the group. The group with small barriers is the relatively richest. They earn really much more than the group to the left with the very large barriers. A large proportion of women is included in the very large barriers group, and that's also a finding we often see in the data. And you can look at, for instance, cocoa farm size and see the differences there, but also there are assumptions that cocoa farming households can diversify easily, or there's a lot of room to diversify and that they do other things to grow their income. Still, if you can see the farm sizes for the different groups, there is a maximum farm size, and there are limits to actually growing income substantially without also doing other things than looking at farming alone. And also very interesting, there's willingness to invest in cocoa and expansion and cocoa yield increase, vast differences between the groups, as you can see. So this basically helps to design strategies. If you know the households in your sample or in your supply chain, and you know what barriers they have or opportunities they have, you can design better interventions. Next slide, please. So factors to take into account in the design of interventions for them to be effective. Well, I list them there, you can have a look. And specifically, we distinguish in a lot of our assessments between the poorest group with the least opportunities, I would say. And basically, they really need structural change to achieve a living income, because a lot of the interventions based on helping them improve their farm without incentives or proper remuneration haven't been working as far as we see. So we need to think about social protection, cash transfer, price and premium increase, but then that needs to be coupled with supply management because we don't want situations of oversupply. And off-farm income diversification is really important to consider for this group. Next, please. And specifically, what we see is that because some of the interventions are helping a certain group of relatively richer households because they have the opportunity to grow their income, we already see some exclusion of the poorest because basically it's very difficult to get them to grow their income. And that's something we really need to take into account in any intervention design, that we're not forgetting the poorest because basically they need the support the most. And the relatively richer households can be supported with different measures, more from an entrepreneurial support perspective. Next slide, please. And then if you look at the roles of different actors, this is the last slide. It's very important to integrate living income KPIs in strategies, but also to do so harmonized and in a coherent way in your organization or company. We really need to find a way to structurally increase the income of households directly instead of indirectly, especially of the poorest, through cash transfers and price increases. That's really an important thing to be looked at. Increase the voice of smallholders. And there's also a role for governments and multilaterals to really find ways for households to earn income from other sources than farming and decrease the cost of living. And I think that's in a very small nutshell.
Thank you.
And I look forward to questions and discussions.
Thank you, Yuka, for the richness of the presentation, only in 10 minutes. So now, as time is running, I will pass it over to the next expert. So, and before doing it, I just wanted to mention, if you have any questions related to the presentations, please feel free to post them in the chat box. That's the first thing. And the second thing about the links. So if you see any links in the chat box, if they come from my colleague Matt, Carla, or myself, you can consider that they're reliable. Other links, please do not click, because sometimes it turns out that it can be spam. So with this, welcome Ilaria. Ilaria Ida Walton is the Global Socioeconomic Impact Lead at Mars. And Ilaria will introduce the Farmer Income Lab and will also share with us a case study on living income from Côte d'Ivoire. Over to you, Ilaria.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Well, first of all, a few words really about the Farmer Income Lab. So the Farmer Income Lab was founded by Mars in 2017. And it was founded really as what we call a think do tank. It's an industry, by industry for industry initiative, and it was established to accelerate evidence-informed action with the goal really to enable farmers to earn a living income. It's got 3 private sector members, Mars, AB, and Bev, and Danone. We purposefully kept it small because we wanted really to learn and experiment and move quickly. We've got a fabulous advisory council with the Livelihoods Fund, Oxfam, IDH, the Gates Foundation, and UNDP. The advisory council really supports the Farmer Income Lab leadership team in making decisions around our research agenda, and really generally gives advice on specific areas, for instance, our Lighthouse programs, which I will tell you a little bit more in a minute. If we could move to the next slide, please. Why do we set up the Farmer Income Lab? I mean, first of all, the timing is everything, right? I mean, these days, for those of you who are very versed with living income is really becoming mainstream, and it was about time. But in 2017, it wasn't. There was there were a lot of programs on livelihoods, in essence, trying really to tackle the typical challenges that smallholder farmers are facing, which are a lot of what Yuka has already covered. But what we observed as a business is that these programs tended to have very low impact and not be very effective in really tackling the issues that farmers were facing. We also saw that there was a real gap in evidence of what works to close the gaps to living incomes, and there was no agreed global framework really on living incomes. Also, the roles between actors, from companies to NGOs to multi-stakeholders groups and origin governments and funders was a bit unclear, who is supposed to do what and how. And the status quo really limited the business resilience and growth. So people, in essence, really are still not thriving. So the idea of funding the lab was to try to answer some of these questions and fill in some of these gaps. If you could move to the next slide, please. So the Pharma Income Lab has got, in essence, 3 key work streams. One, it's generating insights. So this is basically our research agenda. We conduct about 2 to 3 research pieces a year. So we commission, obviously, this research to be conducted by experts. So we simply sponsor it. And then we look at obviously putting this research into action in our own programs. So we do have what we call LICOP programs that are basically living income programs in our supply chains, in Danone supply chain, MB and Bev, which really help us testing those innovations. And in what these programs have all in common, it's a shared learning and accountability framework. So we do have what we call the Common Core, which is a monitoring evaluation frameworks, which monitors specific KPIs and how they develop over time, with a big focus, obviously, on farm interventions, but also service delivery models and multinational companies. So we look at these monitoring evaluation frameworks in quite a broad way. And part of course, of this agenda as well, the connected solution work stream, it's also to disseminate our learnings and really have dialogues on these important issues. If we could move to the next slide, please. So what's the business case around living income for a corporate company? We really believe that in order for, if farmers are in essence profitable and they've got good assets and they are not, they don't have a huge amount of liabilities and they don't really have got the big burden of risks, they are ultimately better business partners as well for us. If we support farming communities to reduce their risks, we believe that we will also ultimately reduce our supply chain risks. Because if poverty in supply chains persist, we might really see farmers ultimately moving out of farming and seeking more profitable opportunities elsewhere. And that would be obviously an issue for us, because we rely on a lot of crops for our business that are grown by smallholder farmers. We also believe that with the increasing amount of legislations or regulation rates coming our way, from human rights due diligence and the corporate sustainability due diligence, it is really important to invest in living incomes to make sure we meet emerging reporting requirements. And of course, we are a consumer business, so we believe that we need to invest also in living incomes because of reputational risk and the upstream vulnerabilities to people in our extended supply chains are going to be, increasingly scrutinized. One important thing to reiterate is that Mars very, very rarely sources directly from smallholder farmers. We buy from tier 1 suppliers who buy from cooperatives and smallholder farmers. And there is a really big role to play, though, in strengthening those relationships and making sure that we use our leverage on our tier 1 suppliers to make sure that the work that they are leading with smallholder farmers, it fits, in essence, the standards that we hold ourselves accountable for. If you could move to the next slide, please. So what have we learned from our research? So what works? In essence, and I reiterate really what Yuka was saying in her slides earlier on, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There is the real need for significant transformation to drive progress on living income. And there is no one single actor that can really do it all. However, there are a couple of things that we've learned through research that I think it's worth reflecting on. First of all, is the role of enabling environments. Corporate investment in terms of return on investment, it's going to be much stronger if we work and operate in places with a strong enabling environment. If the enabling environment is not strong, and I'm talking about rule of law, ability to have good infrastructures, having strong rural economic diversifications, potential processing in countries, it is harder for farmers to reach a living income. Another key learning through the work of the Pharma Income Lab is that one farmer is not the same as the other. So there needs really to be an understanding that you cannot have, you cannot treat farmers all in the same way through your living income interventions, because farmers have got unique profiles. You know, it's the different ability to invest, it's the different land size that they have, and different aspirations as well. So that behaviors as well that drive investment, it's critical. So it's important to have holistic farmer-centered approaches in the design of living income programs. Also because, you know, very often farmers are already diversified businessmen and businesswomen. We might buy one crop from farmers, you know, let's say cocoa or mint or rice or palm, but these farmers tend to grow a variety of crops. So if you want to close the gap to living income, you cannot really just focus on the crops you buy, but you really need to develop kind of landscape approaches by which you support the farming households in increasing income from all the sources on the farm and also off the farm. And that's why, for instance, the role of income diversification activities and off-farm opportunities, for instance, that the women in the households can pursue are very critical. And then obviously there is a big role that advocacy has to play. So making sure that we really work towards creating a level playing field, it's critical. So working in coalitions and really looking at policy improvements, it's crucial. Having said that, among all of these learnings, one for me really sticks out, and is the role of procurement practices in driving progress on living incomes. A lot of the programs that we have seen over the last decade always ask changes from farmers. You know, they need to farm more, they need to farm differently, they need to apply regen ag practices, climate resilient practices. But the reality is that the way in which we source from farmers as companies can have a massive implications on their ability to cope and to invest in their farms. So at the center of the Farmer Income Lab Common Core, there is also an element of really looking at putting specific procurement practices in place, like long-term agreements, like offtake agreements, like floor prices, that really de-risk farmers and put really a stake on the ground on how committed we are to really supporting their long-term business development. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of the 8 largest programs that are running. These are all very recent. They've been set up over the last 18 months. They are for Mars, mainly in cocoa, but we've got also a program that it's just been launched in mint in India. And then ABM Bev has got a program in Zambia in cassava and sorghum, and in Uganda in barley. And Danone has got coconut programs in the Philippines. And as I said, all of these programs basically use the common core and the learnings from the research and put it into practice. And if we could move to the next slide, please. I would like to say a little bit more about the cocoa program called LEAP that we started in partnership with the Fair Trade Foundation last year. And this program puts in practice those learnings. It's called the Livelihoods and Ecosystem Advancement Programs. It's a program that is aiming to reach about 5,000 farmers in the Ecocrim Cooperative Union in Côte d'Ivoire. They've been a long-standing supplier of cocoa to Mars over 5 years. We do have a long-term volumes commitment with them as well. And this program, it's basically, it is a pilot program because we really want to test which kind of bundle of interventions work best before taking it to scale. It is experimental in its design, and it is farmer-centric. So we don't really assume that there is an average farmer. We are building on the segmentation approach that the Farm Income-led research has really advised. It's the approach we should take, and that's how we are bundling the interventions. The activities are grouped in 3 core intervention areas. They look at cooperative strengthening, they look at income diversification, and access to finance. So they're really focusing on the enablers and the level of the type of intervention that have been shown through the research to have the biggest impact at scale to have sustained impact on living incomes for households. It builds on existing fair trade sourcing relationships, and as a program per se, while it is scalable, it really requires a very strong governance, a very high trust with farmers, and security of contracts, as I said earlier on. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. I know we don't have a lot of time. So in essence, the program has been designed with different graduation pathways. So the reality is that all farmers in these 5,000 farmers, they don't all have the potential to reach a living income. Like Yuka was saying earlier on, there are hurdles like land size, for example, or ability to invest that make living income as a North Star for all of these farmers quite difficult. However, that doesn't mean that a program shouldn't be in place to support all these farmers to better their incomes, with the acknowledgement that some of these farmers will be able to reach a living income within the program lifespan, and some will be able to improve their income considerably. And the idea is that we looked at the different type of farmers. There are farmers that have got high resource but potentially low performance, others that have got high resource and high performance, some others have got low resource but high performance, and then the last segment is the low resource and low performance. And we've basically designed the support packages with this in mind. With the first phase really focus on the stabilization and adjustment for these farmers. And the second phase is really looking at growth and investment. Phase 3 is going to be focused on diversification. And phase 4, it's sustaining, achieving living income and sustaining living income. Really looking, so not only at the cocoa as the main income source, but also looking at trying to diversify depending on the type of farmer, basically. So I'll pause here and see if there's any other questions.
Thank you, Ilaria. So as we're short on time, I would like to give the floor to Christina Archer. Christina is the Senior Private Sector Advisor for the Food and Agricultural Commodity Systems at UNDP. Christina, over for you for some general reflections based on the interventions of the speakers. And we're also noting your questions in the chat box. I see that Yuka has answered many of them, but if there are questions that are addressed to other speakers, we will make sure to answer them after the session and send the answers with the post-session email.
Thank you, Ale. It's great to hear from Yuka and Ilaria. And as we can see from the many questions in the chat, obviously we could have done with a longer session, and hopefully this is the first of many. So this seems to be a subject that many of you on the call today are interested in, are working in, and that's great to hear. UNDP for a few years now has been looking at the concept of living income, and we've been doing some interesting internal reflection on how does this work and fit in with the work that's being done on governance, on inclusive growth, on poverty, on food and agriculture. As you've heard from the presenters today, we've seen that governments are beginning to be really interested in the concept, using it very practically in the cases of the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, using the living wage, so the concept of decency, in the governments in Central America with the banana sector, for example. So it's definitely there from the producing side. And also, as was referred to very briefly by Rita, in the consuming side as well. So we're hearing it, many governments becoming interested and wanting to understand more about this concept. So how does an organization such as UNDP and FAO, how do they engage with this? We're also seeing it, being taken up by many sectors. Obviously, the cocoa sector, as we've heard, is engaged with the topic of a living income, both through the private sector and through governments for quite a while now. But we're also, we know the coffee sector is doing a lot of work on living income since 2020. And again, governments and the private sector are involved there as well. So it's a great frame. Living income has proved to be a great frame for bringing public and private partners together to just think about this concept of decency, to think about poverty from a monetary perspective. But, you know, how do we work together to unlock some of the many levers that both Jukka and Ilaria have mentioned today? I think what came out quite clearly, both in the presentations that we've just heard, but also in the workshop that we had last May that Rita mentioned, was that need for collaboration. You know, there is more work that needs to be done with some of the underlying enabling environment factors. Of course, private sector in different ways can also play their role. But to do all of this, you know, the question that we do always hear is, but what works? How does it work? And how can I engage with that? So that's why having the platforms such as Evidensia and having forums such as this to be able to continue together exploring and seeing and testing out, you know, what is it that we need to be understanding about smallholder incomes, about those farming communities and their incomes and how that relates to sustainable production, I think is absolutely key. So I think that that was also a great learning from us. I know we're at time and there's also a lot of questions in the chat, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you to all the speakers again.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, I think this event should have been 90 minutes, so we have then time to go into the discussions and the questions. However, yes, we're reaching the end. I wanted to thank all our experts, so big thank you to Rita, Jukka, Ilaria, and Christina. A big thank you to the Evidensia team, to Matt and Carla for coordinating all that content and bringing the content to the community and follower program. Thank you to all the participants for joining us today. So in the chat box, you will find a link to a quick survey. This is to give us feedback about the event so we can improve in the future. We will also make sure to send you by email all the materials, the presentations, and the links so you have them handy. And I would also like to thank Sandra and Miria for supporting us today. And hope to see everyone at our future events. So our next FACS community event will be on January 17th. Please do check the digital platform to find out more information on this. Thank you again. Have a great day, evening, afternoon.
Thanks all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.